Hey, did you guys know that New Zealand is actually the top of a giant submerged continent called Zealandia that has long since been under the waves? Pretty cool, right? Did you guys also know that pigs can discover truffles in the ground as deep as 3 feet? I'm ashamed to say that I don't have a dumb joke for the intro. Oh boy. New Zealand is a cool place. Literally. Like, statistically, the temperature in New Zealand is cooler than most other places in Oceania, so I need to set you guys up with some ground rules. Background, prologue, you get the gist. So New Zealand, or in Dutch, Nieuw Zeeland, is unlike many of the other Oceanian and Southern Hemisphere countries. See, despite being right next to Australia, New Zealand couldn't be more different from them. First of all, New Zealand is very mountainous and much chillier and more temperate. The central mountains that run down the spine of the South Island are even called the Southern Alps. What this allows for is a much greater contrast of New Zealand's geography, coming complete with almost every single biome/climate type available, with stuff like huge moors and fjordlands in the bottom south, marshes and spits, sand dunes, mountains, and more, even all on just one island. All of this would play into separating the native tribes of the Maori people, as well as the Moriori, who were the natives of the Chatham Islands over here. Obviously, Australia is pretty far removed from the rest of the land of the living, but New Zealand, separated by water and continents, is even more in honky-tonk. As such, New Zealand remained one of the last places on Earth to be inhabited by native humans. It was only discovered by the Maori in the late 1200s, early 1300s, and the Chatham Islands even later in the mid-1500s. Alright, I sense you want me to shut up. Hee. So you guys remember my friend Abel Tasman from the last video, right? Well, he didn't stop at just no Australia, he continued his voyage to discover New Zealand. Famed Dutchite Tasman landed anchor at Golden Bay in New Zealand's South Island. Interestingly enough, most of New Zealand's population lives on the smaller North Island, when in most of these colonial situations, the population is basically centered around whatever lacquer-varnished tent camp the white man Jimmy rigs. Anywho, Tasman landed there in December of 1642 but got attacked by the native Maori people, and as such, abandoned ship and got the heck out of there. He went north a little bit and mapped out the island's western coasts. In 1645, this new mysterious land went under the moniker of, Nieuw Zeeland, named after the OG province in the Netherlands of Zeeland. I think in Dutch it's like Zeeland or something, you know what I mean. Just like Australia, New Zealand received basically no European contact for nearly a whole century before James Cook visited in 1769, the funny number. He made a few other trips there, but largely, his focus has shifted to the much larger Australia, seemingly. In the 1790s, various white people visited the Maori, mostly to trade, fish, and hunt seals and whales and crustaceos. They also foraged for things like flax and European goodabags. Compared to other native societies the Europeans found, the contact between the white man and the Maori was actually pretty peaceful. Throughout the early 1800s, trading hubs were established throughout North Island, which quickly became the main attraction for Europeans, although some did dot the coastline of the South Island. Christianity was soon introduced to the Maori, which allowed them to learn how to farm, but also gave them literacy. Yeah, for once, introducing Christianity to the natives was actually a good thing, though the Maori were sold into sexual exploitation, but we can ignore that. As much as trade and Christianity benefited the Maori, it also caused their downfall. They were given guns, and when they got an inch, they took a mile. Almost immediately, the Maori started to blast each other's tribes off the face of God's green earth with muskets, causing many of their tribes to be completely eradicated in a short period of time. This essentially caused the numbers of the Maori to plummet dramatically, so, yeah. New Zealand's founding as a colony is a bit odd, considering getting people there was kind of a challenge. Not only because of the absolute whack distance and isolation, but also because many of their colonists were Scottish people or Australians who were colonists in their own right. Eventually, on July 1st of 1841, New Zealand was officially recognized as a separate colony from the Australites. Britain knew that they had to lay down the blueprints to settle it, and they had just the plan. New Zealand already had some settlers, but not nearly enough to be self-sufficient. So the British government and the Church of England made strenuous efforts to push more people to go there, which worked tremendously well, actually. As such, by the 1850s, New Zealand's white settler population reached around 500,000 people. Many of these people came from Scotland's Highland clearances. When the English kicked the Scots off their lands and basically exiled them, they had to go somewhere, so a fresh colony in the middle of nowhere was a good clean slate for them to start. Just a year or two before, the first permanent settlement was founded in 1839, Wellington. The first colony in New Zealand grew exponentially, and a year later in 1840, Auckland was founded. These two would grow on to be New Zealand's most important cities, and one of them is even the capital now. At the time, the New Zealanders lived in relative peace with the Maori, who even ran many businesses and local economies within the settlements. As the white population began to grow throughout the mid to late 1800s, however, the Maori were increasingly pushed off their lands. This was difficult, however, since New Zealand's soil was horrible, and they were confined to basically some islands and isles. They also began to graze sheep as well, since New Zealand had some slightly chilly flatlands, perfect to let wild, imported sheep roam. They also did this with other animals, like cows and stuff, but potato. Short gold rushes also took place in Otago in 1861, causing a brief but powerful immigration and economic boom. By this time as well, New Zealand became a huge exporter of things like beef, mutton, wool, and butter. After this, the economy sagged a bit, but there were still a lot of social programs by this time. Speaking of which, the 1870s was actually a hallmark for New Zealand, considering schools began to pop up all over the islands. They were free of charge and had set curriculums, which was a pretty modern concept for the time. It also helped the population greatly, not surprising coming from one of the most ahead-of-their-time nations. Around this time as well was a considerably large wave of Chinese workers, mostly from southern China, to help mine the gold found on South Island. In one of New Zealand's less fun moments, the white majority reacted with aggression towards the new influx of the Chinese. In fact, new laws began to get passed in New Zealand to specifically shun and/or prevent the movement of the Chinese into New Zealand. The early 1900s saw the rise of New Zealand's further development into a stable society with a planned economy. Strict work schedules, pensions, unions, and more were implemented into New Zealand's society, and also went trust-busting. However, a more pressing issue came up: independence. For much of their history, New Zealand was under the thumb of their much bigger next-door neighbor Australia. They still are! However, New Zealand voted against being merged with Australia, and they stayed separate. In 1907, they finally voted for independence to be a dominion of the British Empire. Independence had been achieved, but they were still heavily tied to the Empire in everything but name. You know what it's time for. 1910s decade, tensions flare, World War I! New Zealand had, interestingly enough, before this, been a conscription country, meaning that every applicable citizen had to recruit in the army for a certain period of time. When World War I broke out, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force was shipped out to the Pacific. For example, they had crossed the turbo-large Pacific Ocean to the island of Samoa and captured it from the German Empire. They also fought in the Battle of Passchendaele in the Western Front, among others. They also had a bit of a colonial empire themselves, as they had also by this time annexed the islands of Fiji, Niue, the Cook Islands, Tonga, and Tokelau, among some other Pacific islands. Today, only Fiji and Tonga became independent, and also, all these places are super small. Alright, island hopping! Also, for some reason in 1923, New Zealand claimed a large slice of Antarctica called the Ross Dependency. New Zealand. After the war, New Zealand joined the League of Nations in 1920 and enjoyed a relative post-war boom. However, during the Depression, New Zealand got hit hard. Unemployment skyrocketed, of course, and both imports and exports plummeted super hard. The government tried to give people busy work to pump up those rookie numbers, but they soon realized that giving highly qualified educated professors, hard-working hunky laborers, and grown-up big boy doctors and lawyers 6-year-old chores didn't fix their problems. However, World War II would soon start, and this is where things get sorta wonky. New Zealand had long been, and still is, a country that was very socially progressive, and had a lot of equality for women and Maori at the time, but they were kind of chummy with Nazi Germany. They were strong opponents of the Treaty of Versailles that punished Germany after World War I, signed pro-trade agreements with them, approved the annexation of Czechia, and minimized any criticism of the Nazi war machine back home. There's so many paradoxes here that I can't explain all of them, but I can guarantee that even a blind man could see one or two. During the war, they were terrified of an impending Japanese invasion, considering they had already invaded most of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and were also threatening Northern Australia. Realistically, it would have honestly been entirely possible for them to have been invaded, but luckily Australia, the United States, or Britain's Royal Navy would have put the kibosh on that. The main fight took place in and around the Pacific, most notably the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, Norfolk Island, and Vanuatu. They sank a few banana boats in the Indian Ocean as well, but that didn't really go anywhere. One also got sent to Sumatra in Indonesia and blew something up, but overall, New Zealand's role in World War II was fairly minimal. Well, that's where we're at today. In the modern era, New Zealand is a great ally to the West, and also neighboring Australia. New Zealand is a world-class economy with a great democracy and has a considerable amount of human rights. Thankfully, its relatively peaceful treatment of the Maori is a diamond in the rough, though there were definitely some pretty janky parts. Not gonna sugarcoat it. Anywho, their unique history is a far cry compared to the other Commonwealth countries. Please make sure to subscribe, it would mean the world to me. I'd love to see you again. Tune in next time when I drink an entire gallon of watermelon lemonade in under 20 minutes, which I did recently and started to feel like magic, and also discovered 15 to 16 new senses. Guadalajara!